My wife, Julia, has a talent. Not the fun kind, like playing guitar or making a steak without turning it into shoe leather. No. Julia's talent is making decisions sound like conversations. She can say, "We should talk about something," with the same tone people use when they say, "We should go skydiving." Casual, friendly, harmless. And then you find yourself falling from 12,000 feet with a stranger strapped to your back and a waiver you didn't remember signing. That's how it started. On a Tuesday night, because of course it was a Tuesday, the universal day for mild disasters, Julia leaned against the kitchen counter while I rinsed a plate and said, "Hey, my parents want us to come over this weekend." I didn't look up. "For what?" She shrugged like it was nothing. "Just a family discussion." Those 3 words should come with a warning label. Just family discussion. That's not a sentence. That's a trap with polite upholstery. I dried my hands, turned around, and gave her the standard husband look. The one that means I'm listening, but I'm also trying to figure out where the hidden camera is. "Okay," I said. "About what?" Julia waved one hand. "Nothing dramatic. Just an idea." "An idea," I repeated. She nodded. "Yeah, a big one, but good." When someone says big but good, it usually means one of 3 things. There's a baby involved. There's a debt involved. There's a baby and a debt involved. Julia smiled at me like I was adorable for not already knowing. "My parents found this place, like a house outside the city, with land." I blinked. "A house? For who?" "For us," she said, as if I'd asked who the sun was for. I waited for the punchline. It didn't come. "Your parents found a house," I said slowly, "and that means we're discussing buying it." "Not just buying it," Julia corrected, like a teacher fixing a student's sloppy handwriting. "It's an investment. We could rent it out when we're not there, or turn it into something, a guest house, a weekend place, maybe even a little business." A business. Julia said it the way people say adventure or spiritual awakening, something vaguely positive that other people usually pay for. I leaned back against the counter and crossed my arms. "Okay, and this family discussion is just brainstorming?" She nodded quickly. Too quickly. Like a dog that just stole food but wants you to believe it's morally innocent. "Just talking," she said. "Seeing what everyone thinks." Everyone. That word hit my ear wrong. When my wife says everyone, it doesn't mean us. It means her family, the committee, the board of directors, the people who treat my marriage like a group project where I'm responsible for the budget and everyone else gets creative control. I kept my tone light. "And what do you think?" "I think it's perfect," she said. There it was. Not interesting, not maybe, not let's explore. Perfect. Julia's perfect is not an opinion. It's a finished product. Still, I wasn't against it. I'm not the guy who hates nice things out of principle. I like space. I like quiet. I like the idea of not hearing my neighbors practice their relationship fights through drywall. But I also like, call me old-fashioned, knowing what I'm signing up for. "All right," I said. "If we're talking, then we're talking. But we have to run the numbers. Mortgage, taxes, repairs, insurance, the whole thing." "Of course," she said, and kissed my cheek like I'd said something charming instead of basic financial hygiene. I should have noticed how smoothly she said it, like she wasn't actually agreeing with me, just acknowledging that I had spoken. I should have noticed the way she didn't ask follow-up questions. No, "What numbers?" No, "How much would you be comfortable with?" No, "Do you think we can afford it?" Just, "Of course," which is what people say when they're humoring a toddler explaining how he plans to buy a dinosaur. I glanced at her. "So, what's the plan this weekend? We go over there, look at pictures, talk about it, decide later?" Julia smiled again. "Something like that. I'm married to a woman who can turn the phrase "something like that" into a legal document." "Fine," I said. "I'm in. But I'm not doing a surprise ambush where someone slides papers across a table like we're closing on a casino." She laughed, actually laughed, like that was absurd. "Oh my God, no," she said. It's not like that. Which is a sentence that, in my experience, means it's exactly like that. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and did what every husband does when he hears the words investment property. I started mentally listing all the ways this could go wrong. Not because I'm negative, because I've lived long enough to know that family investment is just another way of saying, we will all share the excitement and you will carry the consequences. Julia rolled over beside me and said sleepily, "You'll love it." I turned my head. "I might, if it's a decision we make together." She hummed, half asleep. The sound a person makes when they're technically responding, but not actually engaging. I stared into the dark and felt a small, quiet thought form. Nothing dramatic. Just a flicker. This isn't a discussion. I pushed it away. Because I'm reasonable. Because I'm not paranoid. Because I love my wife. Because I assumed adults wouldn't gather like a jury to decide how to spend my money without asking me first. And because at that point, I still believed the words, family discussion, meant what they sounded like. I didn't realize the decision had already been made. Julia's parents lived in one of those houses that smells like permanent certainty. You know the type. Hardwood floors that have never known doubt. Family photos aligned with military precision. A dining table large enough to host negotiations between small countries. When we walked in, everyone was already there. Not arriving, not settling in. Already seated, already comfortable, already mid-conversation. That should have been my first clue. Her mother stood up first, smiling wide, arms open. There they are, there we were. Like a matching set. Her father gave me a nod. The polite kind men give each other when they respect you as a provider, but not necessarily as a decision-maker. "Grab a seat," he said. "We were just talking about the house." Talking, apparently, had been happening for a while. Julia squeezed my hand lightly, guiding me toward an empty chair. Not beside her. Across from her. Across from everyone. Perfect positioning if this had been a presentation. Or a trial. Plates were already out. Drinks poured. Papers on the table. Actual papers. Not contracts exactly, but printouts, listings, photos, price breakdowns, notes in the margins. I glanced at Julia. She didn't look nervous. She looked excited, energized, like someone who'd been waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to sit down. Me. "So," her mom said, tapping one of the pages, "the neighborhood is just beautiful. Quiet, good schools, very up and coming." Her sister nodded. "And close enough to the highway. It's perfect for weekend traffic." Weekend traffic. Interesting phrasing, considering no one had asked how often I planned to be there. Her uncle, who I'd met maybe 4 times in my life but somehow felt deeply invested in my finances, leaned forward. "And the price is actually a steal for that area," he said. "Especially if you think long-term." I smiled politely. The smile you wear when people start explaining your own wallet to you. "Sounds promising," I said. "I haven't seen the numbers yet." There was a brief pause. Not an awkward pause. A coordinated one. Like the band stopping for half a beat before continuing the song. "Oh, we went over most of that already," her mom said. "But you'll catch up." Catch up. That was interesting too. Julia reached over and slid one of the printouts toward me. "Here, this is the overview." I scanned it quickly. Purchase price, estimated renovation costs, rental projections that were optimistic, very optimistic. The kind of optimistic that assumes nothing ever breaks and tenants are fictional creatures who pay on time and never complain. "So," her father said, folding his hands, "the idea is that this is a smart move. You put money into something solid instead of just letting it sit." I looked up. "What kind of financing are we talking about?" He waved a hand. "Standard options, mortgage, maybe a loan, you know." You know. Another phrase that sounds collaborative but isn't. Julia jumped in. "We can handle the payments, especially with the rental income." "We." That was new. I leaned back slightly, eyes moving around the table. Everyone was nodding, smiling, agreeing with each other in that soft, reinforcing way families do when they've already reached consensus. They weren't looking at me for input. They were looking at me for confirmation, like a system waiting for admin approval. "So, you'd rent it out most of the year?" I asked. Her sister answered, "That's the plan." Not Julia answered. Not we discussed. Her sister. "And who's managing it?" I asked. "Oh, we'll figure that out," her mom said quickly. "It's not complicated." Every expensive mistake in history started with those words. I glanced at Julia again. She avoided my eyes, not in a guilty way, but in a focused way. Like someone watching the end of a movie they already knew the ending to. I cleared my throat. "Okay, just so I'm clear, this is still a discussion, right? We're not committing to anything tonight." Julia smiled. A soft smile. Calm, reassuring. "Of course," she said. And then, without missing a beat, turned back to her father. "Dad, tell him what the realtor said about appreciation." That's when I noticed something subtle but important. No one disagreed with her. No one corrected her. No one said, "Well, let's hear what he thinks first." They just continued, as if I hadn't spoken, as if my question had been a formality, a checkbox. Her father launched into a speech about market trends. Her uncle added something about timing. Her mom chimed in with anecdotes about friends who'd waited too long and missed opportunities. Opportunity, timing, growth, all words that sound great when you're not the one signing the papers. I listened. I nodded. I even chuckled at the right moments. Because here's the thing about me. I'm not impulsive, but I'm also not insecure. I don't need to dominate a room to know when I'm being sidelined. And sitting there, at that table, surrounded by people who spoke around me instead of to me, a quiet realization settled in. This wasn't a family discussion. It was a briefing. And my role wasn't partner. It was executor. I looked down at the papers again, tracing the numbers with my finger, and thought, interesting. They're very comfortable spending money they don't technically have, almost like they already know whose responsibility that is. I leaned forward slightly. "All right," I said calmly. "I have some concerns." The room didn't tense, it didn't brace, it didn't react at all. And that's when I knew something was wrong. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sigh dramatically or lean back like I was preparing for a speech. I just pointed at one line on the paper with my finger. "The timing worries me," I said. Calm, neutral, almost boring. "Interest rates are high, renovation estimates are optimistic, and rental income usually looks great on paper until reality shows up." You could have mistaken it for a comment about the weather, not an attack, not a refusal, just an adult sentence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Julia laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an awkward one. A light, amused laugh. The kind you give when a kid asks if money grows back after you spend it. "Oh," she said, smiling at me. "We already decided?" There it was, simple, clean, casual. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the table. Then she added, still smiling, still relaxed, still very much herself. "This isn't something we're voting on. Your opinion isn't really part of this." The sentence landed softly. No edge, no anger, no venom, which somehow made it worse. There was a brief ripple of sound around the table. Her sister smiled and nodded. Her uncle chuckled under his breath. Her mom tilted her head like Julia had just said something clever. No one corrected her. No one looked uncomfortable. No one said, "Hey, that's not fair." They just accepted it, like she'd stated an obvious fact. A few smiles appeared. That was the price of admission. If I'm the one financing this, if I'm the one taking on the loan, the liability, and the long-term responsibility, then my opinion has to be part of the decision. I didn't dress it up. I didn't joke. I didn't soften it with just my 2 cents, or maybe I'm wrong. I said it plainly, calmly, like an adult explaining gravity. For a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, the room froze. Not because what I said was outrageous, but because it disrupted the script. Her uncle shifted in his chair. Her sister looked down at her plate. Her mother's smile tightened, just slightly. Then Julia laughed. Not the laugh you give when something's funny, the laugh you give when someone misunderstands their role. "Oh," she said, waving her hand gently, like she was calming a situation that didn't need calming. "Let's not do this here." I blinked once. "Do what?" "This," she said again, gesturing vaguely between me and the table. "We'll talk about it at home." There it was. Not a counter-argument, not a question, not even disagreement, just postponement. A soft dismissal dressed up as maturity. I held her gaze. "We are talking about it. Right now." Julia smiled again, but this time, the smile had an edge. The kind of smile that says you're being difficult in front of people. "This isn't the time," she said, still perfectly calm. "You're overcomplicating things." Overcomplicating. That word landed harder than the others, because what I'd said wasn't complicated. It was basic math. Responsibility equals input. Her father cleared his throat, eager to smooth things over. "Well," he said, nodding at Julia, "we can iron out details later. No need to derail the evening." Derail. Interesting choice. As if the train wasn't already moving, just without me in the conductor's seat. I looked around the table. No one met my eyes. Not one person said, "He's right." Not one person asked, "What are your concerns?" They weren't shocked. They were simply done with the interruption. Julia turned slightly toward her mother, already reclaiming the flow. "So like I was saying," she continued, "if we move forward next month, the timing works perfectly." Just like that, conversation resumed. Not awkwardly, not cautiously, seamlessly, as if I hadn't spoken at all, as if my sentence had been absorbed and discarded without processing. I leaned back in my chair and let my hands rest on my thighs, not because I had nothing left to say, but because I suddenly understood something very important. This wasn't a disagreement, it was a boundary demonstration. I could raise concerns, as long as they stayed private. I could have opinions, as long as they didn't interfere with momentum. I could pay, without participating. Julia didn't need me to agree. She needed me to comply quietly. And when I didn't, she didn't argue. She postponed me, turned me into a later problem. I stopped talking, not in protest, not to make a point. I stopped because there was nothing left to clarify. The rules had just been explained to me in the clearest way possible. Julia went on, outlining next steps, using "we" generously and selectively. Her mother nodded along. Her sister smiled. Her uncle asked about timelines. No one noticed that I hadn't spoken again, because to them, the important part had already happened. I'd been put back in my place, and sitting there listening to my future being discussed like a completed purchase order, I felt something settle in me. Not anger, not humiliation, something colder. Understanding. This wasn't a family discussion. It was an announcement, with a courtesy pause for the person paying the bill. And now that pause was over. The drive home was quiet. Not the awkward kind, not the angry kind, the normal kind. That's what made it strange. Julia drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually near the cup holder. The radio played softly, some inoffensive song about love or timing or both. Streetlights passed by in steady intervals, lighting up her face for half a second at a time. She looked fine, relaxed even, like we'd just left a pleasant dinner. She talked about the house, about how her mom already had ideas for landscaping, about how the guest room could double as an office, about how nice it would be to get out of the city sometimes. She spoke in that easy, flowing way people do when everything has gone exactly according to plan. I listened. Or rather, I heard the words, but I wasn't really in the conversation anymore. I nodded once or twice at the right moments, said yeah when a response was expected, kept my tone neutral. Julia didn't notice anything was wrong. which in hindsight should have told me everything I needed to know. At a red light, she glanced over. "You're really quiet." I kept my eyes on the road ahead. "Am I?" "Yeah," she said, not concerned, curious. "You usually have opinions." There was a faint smile on her face, like this was an observation, not a warning sign. I let a few seconds pass, not dramatically, just enough. "I said what I needed to say," I replied. She waved it off immediately. "I told you, we'll talk about it at home." There it was again. Later. Always later. She turned back to the road, satisfied the issue had been neatly filed away. I watched her drive and thought about how easy it must be to genuinely believe nothing had happened. For her, the evening had been a success. The family was aligned. The plan was moving forward. The minor inconvenience of my question had been managed without conflict. Problem solved. At another light, she sighed lightly. "You're overthinking this." That sentence used to irritate me. Tonight, it didn't. Because irritation requires expectation, and something in me had already adjusted. "I'm not overthinking," I said evenly. She shrugged. "You always do this when my family's involved. You get tense." Tense. That was interesting. I'd sat calmly. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't embarrassed anyone. I hadn't even argued. But apparently, stating a boundary qualified as tension. I glanced at her. From my perspective, I was pretty relaxed. She laughed softly. "Okay." That laugh again. The one that means we're not actually discussing this. We pulled into our driveway. The garage door rose with its usual mechanical groan. Julia parked, turned off the engine, and unbuckled her seatbelt. She didn't look at me. Instead, she grabbed her purse and said, "We'll sort it out later. Don't let it ruin your night." Your night. As if the discomfort belonged solely to me. Inside the house, she kicked off her shoes and went straight to the kitchen, already moving on. Pouring herself a glass of water. Checking her phone. I stood there for a moment. Something about the way she transitioned so easily, from family meeting to normal evening, felt surreal. Like we hadn't just left a room where my role in my own marriage had been quietly clarified in front of an audience. Julia leaned against the counter and finally looked at me. "You're really still thinking about that?" I met her eyes. "No," I said. "I'm done thinking about it." She smiled, relieved. "Good, because there's really nothing to fight about." I nodded slowly. She was right. There was nothing to fight about. Because fights are for disagreements. And this wasn't one. This was a revelation. She turned away, already scrolling through something on her phone. I stood there in the quiet house and realized something that surprised even me. The moment hadn't made me angry. It had made me clear. Clear about where I stood. Clear about how decisions were made. Once you notice a pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. That night, lying in bed beside Julia, listening to her breathe evenly like nothing in the world required further processing, my mind started doing something it hadn't done in a long time. It reviewed, not emotionally, methodically, like scrolling through old emails you never bothered to reread, until suddenly they explain everything. The house wasn't the first time. It just felt like the first time because it happened in public. I remembered the vacation, the one where Julia had said, "Let's just look at a few options," and somehow we ended up booking the most expensive one because her parents had heard great things, and it made sense long term. I'd raised a concern back then too. Not a refusal, just a question. Is this really the best use of money right now? She'd smiled then too. "We'll figure it out," she'd said, which translated to, "You'll figure it out." Then there was the car. Not my car. Her car. We talked about upgrading. I'd suggested waiting a few months, seeing how things shook out at work. A week later, she came home excited. "I test drove something today." By the end of the month, we were signing papers. When I hesitated, she'd said, "You're good with finances. You'll make it work." A compliment that felt supportive. until you realized it came with an invoice. And then there were the smaller things. Furniture purchases, weekend plans, commitments I learned about after they were already agreed to. Each time, my opinion was welcomed. Right up until it wasn't. Right up until it introduced friction. Then it became overthinking, or negativity, or unnecessary stress. I stared at the ceiling and felt something tighten, not in my chest, but lower, quieter. Understanding doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just settles in and refuses to leave. My opinion didn't matter, but my responsibility always did. I paid, I adjusted, I absorbed the consequences, and in return I was told how reasonable and reliable I was. The kind of man people like to have around, not to consult, but to depend on. I turned slightly and looked at Julia. She slept peacefully, her face relaxed, like someone who hadn't dismissed her husband in front of her entire family just hours earlier. That's when I realized something else. She didn't see what happened as disrespect. To her, it was normal. That might have been the most unsettling part. Because you can argue about mistakes, you can fight about tone, but when something is normalized, it doesn't feel wrong enough to apologize for. And if she didn't see a problem, then the problem wasn't a moment. It was the structure. I exhaled slowly and closed my eyes, not angry, not plotting, just adjusting my expectations. Because once you understand the rules of a game, you stop playing it the same way. The next morning was aggressively normal. Julia moved through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who believed everything had been neatly postponed, not unresolved. Coffee brewed, toast popped. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't feel the need to hide. She looked rested. I looked awake. That felt like an important distinction. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter. "You want some?" "I'll make it later," I said. She nodded, already mentally moving on. I watched her for a moment, not in a dramatic way, just observing, the way you watch something familiar after realizing you might have misunderstood what it actually was. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She looked up. "Sure." "When exactly," I continued calmly, "do I get a say in decisions I'm expected to pay for?" No accusation, no raised voice, just a question. Julia blinked once, then laughed lightly. "Wow, you're still on that?" Still, like I'd brought up something old, settled, irrelevant. "I'm not on anything," I said. "I'm asking." She sighed and took a sip of her coffee. "You're making this more dramatic than it needs to be." There it was. Drama. The universal label for boundaries people don't want to acknowledge. "I'm not being dramatic," I replied. "I'm being specific." She shook her head. "You know how my family is." That sentence carried a lot of weight. It was explanation and justification and dismissal, all in one. "So that's it?" I asked. "That's just how things work?" She shrugged. "This is how couples work." Couples. Plural. As if this dynamic had been peer-reviewed. I waited to see if she'd add something else. She didn't. "So, when you said my opinion wasn't part of the decision," I said, "you meant it." Julia didn't deny it. She didn't correct it. She didn't even soften it. She just looked slightly annoyed. "I didn't mean it like that." "But that's what you said." She exhaled sharply. "You're focusing on words instead of intent." Intent. Another word people use when they don't like the consequences of what they actually said. "So the intent was what?" I asked. She hesitated for half a second. Just enough. "The intent," she said, "was to move things forward without turning it into a debate." A debate. That was interesting too. Apparently, my involvement qualified as friction. I nodded slowly. "So my role is to support decisions once they're already made." She frowned. "That's not what I said." "But it is what you described." Julia crossed her arms. "I don't understand why you're turning this into some kind of power thing." I looked at her. "Because it is." She scoffed. You're being unfair. I smiled slightly, not because it was funny, but because the pattern had fully revealed itself. Unfair meant inconvenient. So let me get this straight, I said. If something affects our finances, my responsibility is automatic, but my input is conditional. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, I just don't see it that way. That was it. That was the answer. Not a misunderstanding, not regret. Just a difference in perspective she had no intention of changing. And in that moment, something very simple happened. I stopped trying to be understood, because understanding only matters when both sides are listening. I didn't announce a decision. I didn't sit her down for a serious talk or frame it like a turning point, because people expect drama when something is about to change. I wasn't interested in giving her that courtesy. I just adjusted. The first thing I did was stop following up. No more, did you hear back from the realtor? No more, what's the next step? No more, let me know when you need me. When Julia brought it up, I listened politely, nodded, gave neutral responses. Sounds like you've got it handled. Seems like you've thought it through. Let me know if something changes. At first, she didn't notice, which made sense. My participation had never really been required anyway. A few days later, she mentioned that her dad wanted to move quickly. Of course he does, I said. She looked up. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I replied. Just an observation. She frowned, but let it go. Then came the emails. She forwarded me one from the bank with a subject line that included words like pre-approval and documentation needed. Can you look at this when you have a minute? She asked. I glanced at it, closed my laptop. I don't think I should, I said. She laughed lightly. What do you mean? I said calmly. This isn't something we're voting on, remember? The words landed softly, too softly. She stared at me for a moment, processing. That's not what I meant, she said. But that's what you said, I replied. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I didn't push. I didn't explain. I just went back to what I was doing. Over the next week, I removed myself piece by piece. I didn't schedule calls. I didn't sign anything. I didn't give reminders or suggestions. When she asked about timelines, I said, I'm not involved enough to answer that. When she mentioned numbers, I said, you've already decided what works. We'll need to move some money around, she said casually. From your account. I looked at her. No. She blinked. What? I'm not moving money for a decision I'm not part of. Her tone sharpened. So what? You're punishing me now? I shook my head. I'm adjusting my involvement. She stared at me like I'd started speaking a different language. This is childish, she said. I smiled faintly. No, this is consistent. She didn't like that. Because consistency is hard to argue with. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and headed toward the door. Where are you going? She asked. Out, I said. You've got things under control. And for the first time since that dinner, I meant it. After a short walk, I returned home. That was the first time she looked unsettled. Not angry. Uncertain. I feel like you're shutting me out. I nodded. I am. She stared at me. Why? Because I was already out, I replied. I just didn't notice. Her eyebrows drew together. So what? You're just done now? That's it? I set my book down. I'm done pretending I'm involved. Her tone sharpened instantly. This is manipulative. I smiled slightly. So is making decisions in public and asking for support in private. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The next morning, the panic arrived fully formed. She was pacing the kitchen, phone in hand, voice tight. The bank needs confirmation, she said. They're asking about the account. I poured myself coffee, took my time. And I need you to sign off on it. I looked at her over the rim of the mug. No. Her eyes widened. You can't just say no. I can, I said. And I am. Her voice rose. You're doing this to punish me. I shook my head. No, I'm responding to the structure you set. She laughed, sharp and humorless. You're acting like a child. I took a sip of coffee. Children throw tantrums. I adjusted my involvement. She slammed her phone down on the counter. So what do you want? An apology? I thought about it. No, I said. I want consistency. She scoffed. That doesn't even make sense. It does, I replied. You wanted control without dialogue. Now you have silence without participation. She stared at me, breathing faster. This isn't how marriage works, she said. I met her eyes. It is when one person stops being treated like a partner. That's when the anger faded, and fear took its place. Because anger assumes leverage. Fear shows up when it's gone. Her voice dropped. So what? Are you just going to sit there while everything falls apart? I shrugged. I'm not involved enough to answer that. She stepped back like I'd pushed her. For the first time since I'd known her, Julia didn't know what to say. Not because she lacked words, but because none of them worked anymore. The deal didn't collapse overnight. It died slowly. The realtor stopped calling first. Then the bank emails became shorter, less confident, more cautious. Then Julia's father started asking questions that hadn't existed before. Did something change with the financing? Are we still moving forward? Should we pause for now? That word suddenly meant very little. Because I wasn't in the process anymore. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't moved money. I hadn't reassured anyone. And without that quiet certainty I used to provide, the entire plan started wobbling. Julia tried to hold it together. At first she told her family I was just busy. Then that I was thinking things through. Then that I was being difficult. Eventually she stopped explaining. The house was taken off the table. Someone else made an offer. Someone else moved forward. Someone else took the risk. One evening, a few weeks later, Julia sat across from me at the kitchen table. No phone, no crossed arms, no rehearsed tone, just tired. So that's it, she said. You really let it fall apart. I looked at her. No, I stepped out. She shook her head. You could have said something. I did, I replied. At the table. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You embarrassed me. I nodded slowly. You did that first. That was the moment it finally reached her. Not the money, not the house, the shift. She realized she'd expected compliance to feel like partnership, and silence to feel temporary. Instead, it had become permanent. We didn't separate that night, but something fundamental changed. She stopped making plans for me, and I stopped pretending that was enough. Now, when decisions come up, she asks, not casually, not performatively, actually asks. Sometimes I answer, sometimes I don't. Because here's the part people don't tell you. Once you stop being treated like a resource, you don't rush back to being one.